Hello friends, we'll be discussing the concept of price elasticity of supply. Now, we have already understood what is price elasticity of demand. That means those 5 types of elasticity. Same thing we'll be understanding when it comes to supply part and the determinants that can change the price elasticity of this supply. Now, again, we know that it is perfectly relative, or rather perfectly elastic, perfectly inelastic, relatively inelastic, and unitary elastic of price, or rather elasticity of supply. Now this whole concept will be understood right now. Let us understand few more details related to this. Now this law of supply indicates the direction of change in the quantity supplied in response to the change in its price. This law of supply states that the direction in the change of quantity supplied in the response to the change in price. We understand there is a positive response here. Why? Is because with every increase here in the quantity, because the law of supply is clearly evident enough that if the price is changing, the law of supply states that the quantity will increase here. That is the positive slope, because demand, it has an opposite direction, it goes down. That means if the price is increasing, demand will fall. Here it is not the same, it is different, it is positive slope. It does not express the magnitude of change in the amount supplied in response to the change in price. It doesn't reflect the magnitude. In what magnitude it is changing, it won't reflect that, but it will only say that this has been done or this is going further. Now this information is provided by tool of elasticity of supply. How is this information provided? With the usage of tool of elasticity of supply. Like the elasticity of demand, the elasticity of supply is the relative measure of degree of responsiveness of the quantity supplied to the change in its price. Now, this elasticity of demand, or rather the elasticity of supply, is a relative measure of the degree of responsiveness of quantity supplied of a commodity to its change in price. So whatever change in price are there, based on that, what is the magnitude of change in the quantity supplied here is what we are going to study. The greater the responsiveness of quantity supplied of a commodity through the change in price, the greater is the elasticity of supply. So the higher the quantity, or rather the higher the change in the magnitude of supply because of the change in price, the higher is going to be the elasticity, that is greater than 1. To be more precise, the elasticity of supply is defined as a percentage change in the quantity supplied. That means percentage change in quantity supplied upon percentage change in price. So this is the formula that is being applied here. So percentage change in quantity supplied divided by percentage change in price. This determines the elasticity of supply. This determines only the elasticity. It doesn't say that it is perfectly elastic or perfectly inelastic. We need to understand that in more depth. If it may be noted that the elasticity of supply has a positive sign because of the positive relationship between price and supply. Here we need to understand that demand there was negative supply and negative slope, hence there was positive and negative both. Here it shares a positive relationship because there is a positive outflow. Increase in prices leads to increase in supply, so that is fine, hence it shows a positive relationship here. The formula for calculating this is percentage change in quantity supplied upon percentage change in price. This is the same thing that we have discussed right now. Now, the next part refers to, there are 5 types of price elasticity depending on the magnitude of response to the change in supply in price. That means, again, based on the change in magnitude of the quantity supplied upon the change in price, we need to understand what is the exact magnitude, or rather what is the price elasticity of supply here. There are 5 types basically. The first one would be perfectly elastic. The next one would be perfectly inelastic. The third one would be relatively elastic supply. Fourth will be relatively inelastic. And the next one will be, or rather the last one will be unitary elastic supply. So everything remains the same, only the demand word has been replaced by supply, but it changes a lot of meaning here. Hence, we'll be reiterating this whole topic. Now, the next part refers to, first example, perfectly elastic supply. The supply is said to be perfectly elastic when a very insignificant change in the price leads to infinite change in the quantity supplied. Again, the same reason, same explanation. perfectly inelastic or rather perfectly elastic. This what we're talking about is perfectly elastic. So if there is a small change, insignificant, why we call it insignificant is because there in that scenario you understand that this change is not going to bring so much of effect when it comes to visually understand that. So 70 rupees and 72 rupees, it's an insignificant change. 70 to 71 is an insignificant change. 70 to 700 is a significant change. There is no significant change here. That's an insignificant change in the price. But because of this insignificant change in price, there is a lot of significant change in the quantity supplied. Hence, in this situation, it will be termed as perfectly elastic supply. A very small rise in the price causes supply to rise infinitely. Likewise, a very insignificant fall in price reduces the supply to zero. Now, what they have mentioned is if there is insignificant change in the price, the supply increases infinitely. Similarly, if there is insignificant change in the price, that means if it falls down, supply goes to zero. Again, this will be only in theory, practical life not possible. The supply curve in such situation is horizontal, running parallel to the x-axis. So if this is the y-axis, this is the x-axis, here the supply curve will be running like this. In demand, it used to run like this. So this is demand, this is supply. So supply curve will be running parallel to x-axis. However, demand curve in the same situation, perfectly elastic, will run parallel to y-axis here. Now, numerically, elasticity of supply is said to be equal to infinity. Here in this situation, it will be termed as infinity exactly. So this will be termed as infinity. This is a sign of infinity that you need to understand here. Now, the next concept refers to perfectly inelastic supply. The supply is said to be perfectly inelastic when the change in the price produces no change in the quantity supply of the commodity. कुछ फर्क नहीं पड़ता. So basically, you increase the price, you decrease the price, quantity supply is going to be the same. कुछ फर्क नहीं पड़ने वाला उसके अंदर. If this is the situation, it is perfectly inelastic supply. Hence, it is termed as inelastic. Now you know the difference between why it is called elastic and inelastic. Where there is change in the quantity supplied, then yes, it is elastic, or rather it is elastic here. If there is no change in the quantity supply, कुछ फर्क नहीं पड़ता, increase करो, decrease करो, मैं इतना ही भेजने वाला हूँ, then it is inelastic. In such case, quantity supplied remains constant regardless of the change in price. Whatever quantity has been supplied remains unchanged no matter whatever the change in price is. The amount supplied is totally unresponsive to the change in price. The supply curve in such situation is a vertical line parallel to y-axis. So in this case, it will be parallel to y-axis. This is the supply curve. It will be parallel to y-axis because no matter whatever the change in price is, I'll supply only this much of quantity. So if this is a quantity, okay, I am increasing the price to this, I'm increasing the price to this, I'll still send only this much of quantity. That is pre-decided. Nothing will change it. Now, numerically, elasticity of supply is said to be equal to zero. Here, elasticity of supply will be equal to zero in such situation where there is perfectly inelastic supply. Now, let's go on to the next concept that states about relatively elastic supply. The supply is relatively elastic when a small change in the price causes greater change in the quantity supplied. Perfectly or rather relatively elastic, when do we call it? When there is a small change in the price. There is a small change in the price that causes greater change in the quantity supplied. If it is causing greater change in the quantity that is being supplied because of the small change in the price, yes, that is known as relatively elastic supply. In such case, a proportionate change in the price of a commodity causes more than proportionate change in the quantity supplied. Proportionate change in the quantity here, or rather proportionate change in the prices, is more than the proportionate change in the quantity. So if price is increased by 10%, here quantity will not be nothing more than 10%, will be less than 10%. So for example, if the price changes by 10%, the quantity of the supply of commodity changes more than 10%. Hence, this will be more than 10%. It will be more than 10%. So if the price is decreasing by 10%, here the quantity supplied will be more than 10%. Hence proportion se thoda upar. Whatever proportion price is changing, not necessary that it will be the same proportion, it will be more than that proportion. This is when relatively elastic supply is supposed to be considered. The supply curve in this situation is relatively flatter. Now the supply curve will be more flatter here. Here, elasticity of supply is greater than 1 because quantity supplied is more than the proportion of what the price is changing. The next part refers to relatively inelastic supply. It is a situation where a greater change in price leads to a smaller change in quantity supplied. So there is greater change in price. Price is increasing by more than 10%, but the quantity that is increasing is less than that proportion. So if this is 10%, this will be 5% or something less than the proportion that is already changing. The demand is said to be relatively inelastic when proportionate change in the price is greater than the proportionate change in the quantity supplied. So whatever quantity I am supplying, it is less than the proportion change in the price. For example, if the price of the commodity is increased by 10%, now the quantity supplied will be less than that proportion. It will be less than 5%. ज़्यादा कुछ फर्क नहीं पड़ने वाला उसके ऊपर. That is relatively inelastic. For example, if the prices rise by 20%, quantity supplied rises less than 20%. Hence, it is inelastic. The supply curve is relatively steeper. Now, in this scenario, the supply curve will be very steep. Numerically here the ES or rather elasticity of supply is less than 1. Why? Is because the quantity supplied is not in proportion to the change in price, or neither it is greater than in change in price. If it was that, it would be known as relatively elastic, and here the elasticity will be greater than 1. Now the next concept refers to unitary elastic supply. The supply is said to be unitary elastic when change in the price results in exactly the same percentage of change in the quantity supplied, just like demand. Here, if the change in price, if 10% increase in price happens, commodity or rather goods that are being supplied here will also increase by 10% or decrease by 10%, whatever is the scenario. In such situation, the percentage change in both the price and quantity supplied is the same. For example, if the price falls by 25%, the quantity supplied also falls by 25%. This has been mentioned. If it is a straight line through the origin, normally elasticity of supply here equals to 1. So ES is equals to 1 here. Why? Is because the percentage change in quantity or rather percentage change in price here, the proportion is same. Hence, this is known as unitary elastic supply. Now, the next part refers to what are the determinants of price elasticity of supply. We have understood about determinants which affect or other factors that affect the price elasticity of demand. Here we'll be understanding what are the factors that affect the price elasticity of supply. ऐसे क्या क्या factors है जिसकी वजह से supply change हो सकता है, और because of that thing my price elasticity of supply will keep on changing. Let us understand that. Now, the first change or rather the first factor could be because of the time period. Time is the most significant factor which affects the elasticity of supply. If the price of a commodity rises and the producers have enough time to make adjustments in the level of output, the elasticity of supply will be more elastic. That means if the price of any commodity increases here and the producers have enough time to adjust those changes into the level of output, then it will be absolutely fine. The elasticity won't be affected here. If the time period is short and the supply cannot be expanded after a price increase, the supply is relatively inelastic. But if the time period is short to accommodate those changes into the level of output, then here the supply will be inelastic despite the price change. Hence, time period is one of the important factor here. Now, the next refers to ability to store output. जितना सप्लाई करेंगे जगह तो होना चाहिए रखने के लिए. If we are sending off so many goods and if there are no warehouses to store those goods, where will you put this output? If you are producing so much of goods, you need to have, of course, supply है, सब कुछ है, but if you don't have anything, what is the effect of that supply? किधर रखोगे? You cannot place that thing. Hence, the goods which cannot be safely stored have relatively elastic supply over the goods which are perishable and cannot be stored. So basically, if apples, fresh fruits are being supplied in an enormous or exorbitant quantity, if they're of perishable nature, you'll have to have that thing within the time period. You cannot extend that. But if you buy a car, you can keep that for years. Can you buy an apple and keep it for years just like the same way it is? No. Perishable good. Hence, here when it comes to perishable goods, the supply is relatively inelastic, or rather we can talk about inelastic supply there. Now, mobility factor or factor mobility. If the factors of production can be easily moved from one use to another, it will affect the elasticity of supply. The higher the mobility of factors, the greater is the elasticity of supply of goods and vice versa. So basically, when we're talking about mobility of factors, these factors, these determinants, if they can be moved from one point to another and can be used for different purposes as well, here the elastic will be, or rather the elasticity of supply will be relatively elastic, perfectly elastic we will call it. But if it is not, then it will be vice versa, it won't be elastic that much. Hence factors that are used, जो भी factors use होने वाले हैं production के लिए, or rather certain factors like the cost of production of all these things can be adjusted, can be manually handled, or can be lowered, or something like that can happen to it, then it can be added, or rather it can have a certain change in the price, or rather it can have certain change in the elasticity of supply. This is what you need to understand. Now the next part refers to cost relationship. If costs rise rapidly as output is increased, then any increase in the profitability caused by a rise in price of the good is balanced by increased cost as supply increases. If the cost is rapidly increasing, hence they have mentioned, let me highlight it, cost rises rapidly as output is increased. I am increasing my supply, hence my output is increasing. Hence, to prepare that much of output, my cost is increasing. Simple sense. Then any increase in the profitability caused by the rise in price of the goods is balanced by the increased cost of supply. तो इसका मतलब क्या है? My cost of production is increasing because I'm increasing the supply, correct? Now I'm increasing the price, hence this will be balanced. If the price is not increased and my cost of production is increasing, hence in that scenario I am making a loss. But if it is balanced equally, then I am making a profit here because it is the same thing. जो चीज़ पहले मैं रास्ते के कपड़े उठा के पहनता था, now I'm wearing some branded clothes because my income is also supporting that part. Hence it is balanced here. If this is so, supply will be relatively inelastic. So supply will be relatively inelastic if this is the case, because here in that scenario it is the same thing, na? There is no change happening because of price rise. There is no increase or decrease in supply. It is being balanced here because the cost of production is also adding to it, or if the cost of production is adding, price increase is also adding to it, so it is balanced. Hence supply is inelastic here. On the other hand, if cost rises slowly as output increases, supply is likely to be relatively elastic. Now, on the other hand, if the cost is rising slowly as the supply increases, so no matter if my supply is increasing from 10,000 to 20,000, related to that, the moment I raise it from 20,000 to 30,000, my cost is also increasing. Then with increase in the supply, my cost is also increasing. So I have to increase the price also according to that. So if the cost is here and the supply is here, supply is increasing, the cost of production is also increasing, so I have to raise the price here. Hence in that case, the supply, or rather the elasticity of supply, will be not considered here, or it can say that it is elastic supply here. That is what you need to understand. Now, so whatever we have defined here, whatever we spoke about right now, terms and details explains you about the price elasticity of supply and the determinants that we have understood, that is time period and other factors that we have learned right now. So this is all that we have to study when it comes to this specific chapter, and here we mark the end of this chapter, that is the elasticity of supply and demand and determinants related to that. So this is all that we have to explain in this scenario. Thank you.